I am a lecturer in digital history, and this is sort of a weird title to have in the UK. Not very many people have it. But the idea is not that it is a different form of history, that I'm looking at things that other historians wouldn't, but rather that I really appreciate and really want to promote the use of digital technologies, digital tools, and to sort of a more abstract sense, the idea of digital thinking to more traditional historiographical or history studies. The title of my talk, Breaking Black Boxes, really refers to the idea that so many humanities scholars and social science scholars use tools without fully understanding how they work. They have a general idea of what goes in and a general idea of what comes out, and that is the classic black box. It works well enough, don't ask too many questions, and you get the results you want. And I wouldn't discourage people from using black boxes at all. They are very helpful. They've been well designed in a lot of cases. But sometimes it can be really useful to break the black box open and see how it works, and maybe to subvert how it works to get the kind of research queries you really are interested in out of them. My work is primarily with digital newspapers, and by that I mean digitized newspapers of the 18th and 19th centuries. So I don't really work with born digital materials, newspapers that currently exist online. I instead primarily work with newspapers that were printed on paper, rag and otherwise, and then have been stored in archives for a couple hundred years, some of which were put onto microfilm and microfiche, some of which were then digitized, and some which went straight from being on paper to being electronic copies. And it's really, really fortunate that I did my PhD in the mid-2000s, because you could not have really done what I wanted to do before that period. Most of the research into newspapers had been something called samplings and soundings, the idea that you look through a representative sample of a lot of newspapers, or a case study where you look at one newspaper very, very intensely and try to understand it, its owners, its editors, its contributors, its readers. But over the past 10 years or so, there's been a huge rise in the number of digitized newspaper providers. And these are just a handful of the ones that I actually use in my research. So you have private organizations, things like ProQuest, or the Redex collections, such as the African newspapers. You have publisher-owned archives like the Times or the Scotsman. You have public ones, such as Chronicling America, which is the United States Library of Congress newspapers, or your very own Trove. You also have sort of individuals. I want to give a particular mention to Fulton History, which is that little postcard in the corner, who is a gentleman in upstate New York who bought a microfilm to computer digitizing machine and has single-handedly digitized pages of New York newspapers just because he felt that, New York is more than the New York Times. He's quite correct in that idea. And he wanted to make them available, which he does on his website, which has some very quirky music playing in the background when you use it. By far and away, the most prolific digitizers of newspapers, however, are those interested in genealogical research, commercial genealogical research. Places like Genealogy Bank, which is actually part of Redex. So if you don't have a subscription to Redex, you can get a subscription to Genealogy Bank and get their newspapers that way. Or newspapers.com, which is owned by Ancestry. The British Library newspapers are in part digitized by Find My Past. So these are a lot of interconnections between private, public, and individuals who are making these newspapers available. So why do I mention all that? Well, the difficulty is that these are what we call silos. These are individual corpuses, corpora, that contain newspapers of a particular collection. Europeana, for example, has some newspapers, but a lot of just metadata for newspapers, not the actual newspaper text itself. And all of them have different reasons for digitizing the newspaper, so it exists in different forms. It has different accessibility, and it has different copyright restrictions upon it. So if you are a media historian or somebody who just uses the media in your research, you've got to navigate through a lot of different protocols to get the material that you want. So there are some basic ways you can begin, and basic ways that I began with digital research into newspapers. You want to build upon the existing resources. Use the tools that currently exist in order to answer some of your research questions. Now you'll notice I didn't say basic research questions because it's not a hierarchy. It's not that, oh, you're doing corpus linguistics, that's so 1987. Like, this is not about what is new and what is exciting versus what is old and commonplace. It's about what exists currently to answer the questions you have about your research. So it's really important that you don't get rid of things that are working really well because they've had years to develop. So what are the foundations you can build upon these existing resources? Well, first, you can try just interfacing with the corporation and seeing what the corporation who provides these newspapers will actually give you. So generally speaking, a lot of these newspaper databases give you full text searching, which basically means they give you this simple box. You type in your queries, hopefully slightly more advanced than some of my students who type in things like Martin Luther King and hope for the best. And you can check which types of newspapers or particular newspapers, a date range, maybe a publications that you wanted to search for, basic search parameters that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The difficulty with that is that that doesn't answer a whole lot of research queries. Usually you want to have more specific ideas, and one of the most difficult problems with not particularly Gale Cengage, but most of these newspaper databases was the fact that it was fake full text searching. So what I mean by that is that because these were 18th and 19th century typefaces, the optical character recognition that took the printed page and put it into the computerized text, not perfectly great. What's even more disturbing is that they kept using the same OCR technology for about 10 years, even though OCR improved greatly. They wanted it to be consistent, so they kept using the bad stuff. But what this meant is that when you type in something like George Howe, even if you put it in quotation marks, the universal signal for this is exactly what I mean, it would still fuzzy it. It would still look for, George spelled slightly different ways with little extra letters put in there to account for the fact that it wasn't transcribing it perfectly. Now you're thinking, oh, that's great, because I want all the George Howes, and I can sort through the few false positives. The problem was that if you were searching for a particular turn of phrase, a semantic clause, that if, that the, these stop words that these newspaper databases always pull out, they're really important. Those grammatical clues make a world of difference to some research questions. So you weren't able to do a lot of these search results. The other difficulty is if you type in something and you get 25,000 results, it's quite daunting. And if you have to work with the interface to go click, 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 and look at each individual one, download each individual image, it's a lot of work. But it can be done. People like Bob Nicholson at Edge Hill University has provided a really good article in the Journal of Victorian Culture on how to do a proper search. And people like Dallas Little have basically broken through these search queries to sort of scan through and get the metadata he needs for a more complicated search. So what I'm basically trying to say is that there are search tools available, and you can get the information and the images you need just by going to these providers and obtaining them. Now, behind those interfaces, of course, is the back office, the OCR, transcriptions, and metadata that actually are being searched through. As you probably know, they're not searching the images themselves, they're searching a transcription that they made previously. And this is what one of these transcriptions look like. The transcription actually starts here. This is all just the metadata that comes before the article. And if you break the newspaper metadata down, you get all sorts of really interesting information. So you get information about the newspaper, the date that it was published, which issue it is, information about the production. So in some catalogs, you'll get information about who the editor was or who the author of a particular issue was, and digitization information. Which copy was actually digitized? Is it a microfilm copy, a microfiche, a physical copy? Where is that in the library? Who owns the copyright in the physical object? Going down to the article level, you get information in a lot of these about the page, the column. In Trove, which is slightly notable in this respect, you also get the genre, so is it a news article or an editorial? You also get the medium, so is it text or is it an image or a table, things like that. So this is a lot of really valuable metadata that you can pull out of this data source and do much more complicated studies than just with the text and images themselves. And of course, when you get the text, you get words and coordinates, which unfortunately isn't on here. But basically, each word is its own individual line on these files, and it gives usually a list of X, Y coordinates for where that word appears on the image. And that's really useful if you want to see about foregrounding and backgrounding where there's a prominence of this particular phrase or word on the page. So again, this is all, don't want to say traditional, but this has been available for a while. This is stuff, there's a lot of tools to help you work with this in order to find the text and do interesting things with it. And what I really just want to highlight is don't stop at the text. The metadata is so rich and gives you so many more insights to help you compare and understand these texts and what they mean. So I'll give you an example of a sort of modular workflow using existing tools. This is how I did my initial postdoc research, and it's incredibly, I would be a little bit more sensible nowadays, basically. But I was trying to do something very complicated with zero programming experience at that time, so I was stapling lots and lots of different tools together. So I started with a zip folder that the British Library very kindly gave me of all their newspapers. I unzipped it using 7-zip. I put them into discrete different directories of XML files. I used a find and replace program to remove a bit of code that was disrupting the rest of my process. I cleaned up the XMLs and converted them to text using XSLT, so a program called Oxygen. If there was an error, I had to go through this whole problem to fix it, but if there wasn't, I got to go over here. I used a plagiarism detection software, openly available, called CopyFind, to run all of these text files through to see who was stealing or borrowing or legitimately allowed to use from each other. I was able to turn these into network diagrams using open source program again called Gephi. And I was also able to take select case studies, transcribe them using Notepad, making sure there wasn't any extraneous metadata added, turn this into my own database, and use these individual files to create phylogenetic trees to show the evolution of a particular text as it moved from newspaper to newspaper. This took a very long time to staple together, but it worked. I didn't actually need to program anything in order to have a very robust digital humanities type project. And I was really proud of this because I got some very interesting results that allowed me to continue my research and get more people interested in it. But there's only so far you can go with stapling things together. There is a point when you have to design your own tools. And you know, it can be really helpful to design your own tools because you can sort of understand why the tools you were using were built the way they were, what kind of problems they were trying to solve, and you can cut out a lot of the stuff you don't need. There's a lot of bloat in research software because they're trying to help everybody. And if you're making something for yourself, you can make it just help you. So I do a lot of textual work, and you know, when I go to conferences, that can be quite boring. I put up a lot of images of my newspapers I look at, but in the end, it's a lot of pictures of text. It's a lot of text. My articles are all about text. And I love text, but sometimes I get quite jealous of my friends who do caricatures and images and things like that. So I thought about maybe I should step away from text for a little while and try to think about my newspapers in a slightly different way. What am I missing by focusing so much on the text and the metadata, but not the newspaper as a material object? And one thing I sort of understood after a while is that 19th century newspapers look terrible in comparison to modern newspapers when it comes to layout. They are themselves big walls of text. They have almost no decoration in between the different sections. They have very few headlines, and the headlines they do have are geographic provenance markers. All of these stories came from Paris. They may not be about Paris. Paris might have nothing to do with them, but they came from Paris. So I decided that I was going to try to visualize my newspapers in a different way. So I took the Caledonian Mercury from a couple of different years, a Scottish newspaper, and I separated it out into different articles. Now this is a little subjective because where one article starts and the next one ends, or the first one ends and the next one starts, you have to kind of just use, yeah, it sounds like it's a different article now. I went through them all, labeled them all with what type of article they were, whether they were adverts or news stories, what they were kind of about, and their word count. And then I decided to prototype something in Excel. Now, to make Excel make that graph, you have to make a table that looks kind of like this, which is ridiculous, and you would never normally store your data that way. I am subverting Excel to make it look like a newspaper. But in the end, it was really helpful for me. It gave me a really good way of visualizing how much space was given to different articles, what their footprint on the page was, and I could compare this across years. How does the front page change over time, and how does it change between different pages? But I couldn't do that at scale. That's really a single newspaper. It took me about 3 days to figure out the word counts of all those articles and put that in an Excel spreadsheet. So I worked with a colleague of mine to create a different sort of program. So this visualization is made using Python, a script called Matplotlib. And what I've done is I've created a C++ program. And C++, by the way, is an extremely straightforward programming language. Both Python and C++ are really easy to use once you sort of get your head in a logical do this or this, do this or this kind of way. Lots of tutorials online. But I created this program that basically cut up my newspapers for me and created, this is page 1, this is page 2, and hopefully if anyone in the room is colorblind, these are colorblind friendly images. And it let me do this at scale. So I was recently able to write an article that contained about 40 of these images. So I was able to compare front pages across about 20 years and get a really good idea of not just the size, the footprint of these different articles, but in fact the sources of them. So these different colors actually indicate where they were coming from, so you get a sense of what the news coverage was actually coming from. So these ones, for example, are all local advertisements. That's a national advertisement. These are from London, and these are international. And it gives you a sense visually of how these newspapers are constructed. And this was really important to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it gave me something nice to show at presentations instead of just walls of text. But really, it helped me understand my newspapers in a fundamentally different way while still being text-focused. I wasn't focusing on images, but I was able to understand something about my newspapers I couldn't before. So what I would suggest to all of you is that if you have a crazy idea about a different way to approach your research, take the time to think about how you would like to do that. It doesn't have to be a pre-existing tool. It doesn't have to be a pre-existing methodology. If you can think of something that you would like to do, if you can figure out how to do it manually, even if it takes you a really long time to do it manually, once you have that prototype, you can probably translate that into a computer program to do it at scale for lots and lots of examples. So I want to talk to you now about some resources that I've used in my research that I think would be really helpful for you in your research. So these are lots of different logos. I'm going to go through a couple of them sort of abstractly and then a couple of them more practically. So this first one up in the corner is AntConc, which stands, I think the best way to say it would be Anthony Concordance Software. AntConc was a linguistics researcher who, like myself, decided that he used tools. There's lots of concordance software available, but he wanted one that was very lightweight, that did exactly what he wanted it to do. And so he built it and then put it online. He's got lots of these little tools. There's little ants on all of them because of his name. And basically, this provides a very lightweight way of doing corpus linguistics. It lets you put in a huge number of texts and lets you find correlated words, or it lets you find words in context, or it lets you find base word counts. And these are all really helpful tools when you're starting out with a new set of texts and you want to compare them at scale. It's really easy to install, and even my first year students used it without crying too much. The other thing I would like to talk about is something called Tropy, T-R-O-P-Y, which is something I only recently came into familiarity with, but it's research photo management. And basically, if you take lots and lots of research photos, whether they're manuscripts or sort of surreptitious images of books when you're at libraries in foreign countries, you are able to include them all in a single database. It is a really useful tool for annotating, putting transcriptions, keeping notes of your research photos all in one place. And again, these tools are a way about organizing your research materials and collating them in a way that makes sense for you. Now, what I'm going to show you now are 3 different tools that I use. The first one I'm going to click on is something called Voyant Tools. Now, Voyant is basically an online text analysis suite, and it provides a lot of the same tools that AntConc does, although it does it online. You can upload a corpus to this, and in this case I put in the Sydney Gazette from March of 1803, and it provides you different ways of examining the text. So how often does the term Hawkesbury appear across this period? It also allows you to get the ubiquitous word cloud. It also allows you to find basic topic models. So what words statistically appear together more often than would be normally random. So these 7 weird words always seem to appear together in these articles. So these articles are probably all about the same thing. Lots of different tools for being able to move your text around in different ways. Another source that I used quite frequently, especially in teaching this sort of material, is something called Project Overview. And Project Overview, again, lets you upload your own corpus, and it will divide it into topics for you in this wonderful little tree. So this is Martha Ballard's diary, which was a daily diary by a midwife in 18th and early 19th century US. And it shows all the words that she's used in these entries and then breaks them down into topics. Now, for those of you who haven't used topic modeling, the computer doesn't know what the words mean. They're just meaningless strings of text for it. But you can go and say, oh, these words all seem to have to do with childbirth, or these words all seem to have to do with food, and you can label them yourselves. But again, it helps you pull out collections of documents that you may not have noticed before when you were just reading through them yourself. And finally, the last one I wanted to show you is something called Jupyter Notebook. So if you're interested in going into programming, if you want to start developing your own tools, a really good way to prototype and see how things are working is something called Jupyter Notebook. Again, it's free software to download. And what it lets you do is it puts little tiny, or you can do it all at once, but I tend to put it in teeny little blocks of code, so you can test each one as you're going along. So in this case, if I import all of these dependencies, so the little bits of code from other people that make it work, my data, I tell it to create a graph for me, I tell it to design it to look like my newspaper, and then if I run this last bit, it should pop up with an image, which it does. So this image is created from that little bit of programming code and data. And what's really nice about iJupyter is that there's a huge community of people on GitHub and elsewhere who have put their own notebooks up. So you can take theirs, play with it, see how it works, and edit it to make it work better for your project. So those were the main tools that I've used. I can't possibly go into too much detail in the amount of time I have, but I do want to talk about some resources of people who can virtually go into more detail. Programming Historian, which is a free website of tutorials, just programminghistorian.org. And they provide basically tutorials on anything you can imagine, whether it's programming or using existing tools. This is one that I wrote on XML, which basically that huge modular work plan that I showed you before. This shows you basically how to do that sort of thing with XML and XSLT. So if you have any XML data and you want it to be plain text, or you just want it to look different from how it currently looks, this tutorial should be able to step you through it. But basically all of these are voluntarily written and peer-reviewed to make sure they work on Macs, Linux, and on Windows. And if you do get very good at it, or you're really keen on a particular tool and you want to submit a review, it's a really nice, calm peer review process, so I do highly recommend it. It is called Programming Historian because it was started by historians, but it's basically across the humanities and social sciences now. Lots of tutorials on R and other coding software as well. Another resource I would really like to highlight is Software Carpentry, which is an international organization, and they have workshops where they teach how to program, how to develop your own software, but they also provide their materials online on their website, so you can essentially give the workshop to yourself from your home, and if you get really good at it, give it to other people as well. And I think special attention should go to this resource, who is a gentleman at Carleton University named Sean Graham. He goes on Twitter by the name Electric Archeo as an archaeologist. And basically, if there's a new tool or methodology in the world, he will have found it and played with it online and put all of his code up online. So it's a really good person to follow and learn information from. And he's just a really nice guy in general. So what I really want to kind of close with is the idea that there are black boxes in every aspect of our life and in every aspect of our research. And sometimes it can be very helpful and also kind of therapeutic to just stop, break them open, see if they're doing what we actually want them to do, and if not, play around until they do. So this is the centrifugal governor from the steam engine. This is the Atari 2600 motherboard, and this is actually a workflow diagram for newspaper production. They're all technically black boxes in our everyday life. We use steam engines, we use video game consoles, and we read newspapers. We don't always care about the black box beside them, but maybe we should spend a little bit more time thinking about it. These slides are available online, and if you have any questions for me, I would be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.